Between 1969 and 1978 in Cumberland County, North Carolina, 6 people died with identical symptoms: violent stomach pain, uncontrollable vomiting, and agonizing death within days. Each victim shared one innocent connection: a soft-spoken, church-going grandmother named Velma Barfield, who was always nearby when tragedy struck, ready with a gentle touch and whispered prayer. The deaths were explained as heart failure, gastroenteritis, or tragic accidents. Common enough in rural North Carolina that no one suspected the sweet grandmother who volunteered at church and cared for the elderly. But when 56-year-old Stuart Taylor collapsed during a Pentecostal revival meeting in 1978, his family refused to accept another mysterious death. Their demand for an autopsy would expose Velma Barfield as one of America's most cunning serial killers, making her the first woman executed by lethal injection in U.S. history. Before we continue with the story of the grandmother who turned caregiving into killing, make sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Because this tale could have happened anywhere, trust and faith create the perfect cover for evil. Investigators would discover she had been using nothing more than common rat poison, administered with the precision of someone who had turned murder into an art form. The North Carolina of the 1960s and 70s was a world where communities were built on unshakable foundations of trust, where church attendance was not just encouraged, but expected, and where the concept of a grandmother as a cold-blooded killer was literally inconceivable. In Cumberland County, particularly around the small farming communities like Parkton and Fayetteville, everyone knew their neighbor's business. Children played safely in the streets, and elderly folks never hesitated to invite helpful strangers into their homes. Parkton itself was the kind of place where time seemed to move more slowly. With fewer than 500 residents scattered among tobacco and cotton farms, it was a community where the Baptist Church served as both spiritual and social center, where high school basketball games drew crowds from 3 counties over, and where a person's word was considered as binding as any legal contract. The landscape was dominated by red clay fields that stretched to pine-covered horizons, punctuated by modest farmhouses, and the occasional general store that served as an unofficial community gathering place. Into this world of simple pleasures and traditional values, Margie Velma Bullard had been born on October 29, 1932, in nearby Eastover, South Carolina, but raised near Fayetteville as the second child and oldest daughter among 9 siblings. Her family worked a small tobacco and cotton farm where life was hard but honest, where children learned responsibility early and faith in God was as essential as the daily bread. The Bullard household operated under strict Pentecostal Christian principles, with regular church attendance, daily prayers, and an unwavering belief in moral absolutes. Velma's childhood was marked by the kind of poverty that was common but not shameful in rural North Carolina. Their home lacked electricity and running water, luxuries that many families in the area couldn't afford. When nature called, the family would simply walk into the woods behind their property, a practice that was practical rather than primitive in an era when indoor plumbing was still considered a luxury for city folks. Despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, the Bullard children learned the value of hard work, family loyalty, and community support. In elementary school, Velma proved to be a bright student who excelled academically and showed particular talent for reading and writing. Teachers noted her quiet intelligence and helpful nature. She was always willing to assist classmates who struggled with their lessons and never caused disciplinary problems. Her report cards consistently showed high marks, and there seemed to be genuine potential for academic achievement despite the family's limited financial resources. As she entered her teenage years at Parkton Public School, Velma discovered a passion for basketball that surprised everyone, including herself. Despite not fitting the typical athletic build, she possessed quick reflexes and an understanding of game strategy that made her valuable to the girls' team. Basketball became her escape from the increasing responsibilities at home, a place where she could forget about household chores and family obligations for a few precious hours each week. But this brief taste of independence was short-lived. When her mother Lily gave birth to twins, the family dynamics shifted dramatically. As the oldest daughter, Velma was expected to sacrifice her personal interests for family needs. Lily, overwhelmed by the demands of caring for newborns while managing a household of 9 children, insisted that Velma quit the basketball team to help with housework, cooking, and childcare. The disappointment was crushing for a young woman who had just discovered something she truly enjoyed and excelled at. It was during this period of adolescent frustration that Velma met Thomas Burke, a lanky, dark-haired boy who was a year older and possessed both a gentle nature and a sense of humor that could make her laugh even during her darkest moments. Thomas was not conventionally handsome. He had prominent ears and angular features, but he treated Velma with kindness and respect that was notably different from her father's harsh demeanor. Their courtship was conducted entirely within the confines of school grounds, as Velma's father had strict rules about dating that wouldn't be relaxed until she turned 16. When Velma did reach that milestone birthday, her father arbitrarily decided that 16 was still too young for serious courtship, leaving the young couple frustrated and increasingly determined to find their own path forward. Their romance deepened during stolen moments between classes and brief conversations after church services, where Thomas would often attend just to see her. The decision to elope came as much from desperation to escape her increasingly difficult home situation as from young love. At 17, Velma saw marriage to Thomas as her only realistic path to independence and a better life. On a quiet morning in 1949, they drove to a justice of the peace in a neighboring county and exchanged vows in a simple ceremony that would bind them together for the next 20 years. The newlyweds settled into a small house in Parkton that had once belonged to Velma's extended family, a modest dwelling that represented hope and new beginnings for the young couple. For the first time in her life, Velma had her own home to manage, her own decisions to make, and her own future to build. The early years of their marriage were marked by genuine happiness and shared dreams of creating the kind of stable, loving family that both had longed for during their difficult childhoods. The transformation of the Burke household from haven to hell began gradually in 1965. When Thomas suffered a devastating automobile accident that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of both their lives. The collision, which occurred on a rain-slicked country road during Thomas's commute from his job at a local textile mill, left him with a severe concussion and injuries that would plague him for the remainder of his life. Thomas recovered from his initial injuries and returned to work within a few weeks, determined to provide for his family despite the persistent headaches and dizzy spells that had become his constant companions. But as months passed, it became clear that the damage was more extensive and permanent than anyone had initially realized. The headaches were not merely uncomfortable, they were excruciating episodes that would leave Thomas writhing in agony, unable to function for hours or sometimes days at a time. The pain was so severe that he began missing work regularly, which eventually cost him his position at the textile mill. Without steady employment and facing mounting medical bills, the family's financial situation became increasingly precarious. Like many working-class men of his generation who lacked access to adequate medical care or pain management resources, Thomas turned to alcohol as his primary method of dealing with chronic suffering. What began as an occasional beer to take the edge off his pain gradually escalated into serious dependency as the months turned into years without improvement in his condition. For Velma, whose strict Pentecostal upbringing had taught her that alcohol consumption was among the gravest of sins, Thomas's drinking represented not just a personal failing, but a spiritual crisis that threatened the very foundation of their marriage. She began a campaign to control his drinking that grew increasingly desperate and invasive. She would search their home for hidden bottles, pour discovered liquor down the sink, and even enlist their children in monitoring their father's behavior. The once harmonious Burke household became a battlefield of silent resentment and explosive confrontations. Thomas, humiliated by his inability to work and in constant physical pain, felt betrayed by his wife's monitoring and increasingly controlling behavior. Velma, watching the man she had married dissolve into someone she barely recognized, felt abandoned and frightened about their family's future. The situation reached a crisis point when Velma made the drastic decision to have Thomas committed to Dorothea Dix Hospital in Raleigh for alcoholism treatment. This action, taken without Thomas's consent and involving local authorities, represented the ultimate betrayal in his mind. Though the treatment was successful in helping him achieve sobriety, it came at the cost of destroying whatever trust and affection had remained in their marriage. During Thomas's absence, Velma was forced to support the family through her job at a local mill, work that was physically demanding and emotionally exhausting. To cope with the stress of single parenthood, financial pressure, and uncertainty about her marriage's future, she began taking prescription tranquilizers. Her family doctor, Dr. James Henderson, initially prescribed Valium to help her sleep and manage anxiety. But as her tolerance built, she began seeking additional medications from multiple sources. When Thomas returned from Dorothea Dix, he was sober but fundamentally changed. Bitter, resentful, and emotionally distant from the family he had once cherished. The man who had possessed a gentle nature and infectious humor had been replaced by someone who seemed to blame Velma for his current circumstances and who made no effort to hide his contempt for her actions. The marriage that had begun with such hope and love had devolved into a cold war of mutual antagonism. They continued living under the same roof, but as virtual strangers who communicated primarily through arguments about money, the children, and Thomas's continued inability to maintain steady employment. On the night of April 4, 1969, this toxic situation reached its fatal conclusion. Thomas had been drinking heavily that evening, not enough to pass out, but sufficient to leave him groggy and disoriented. Velma, claiming she needed to run errands that couldn't wait until morning, made the unusual decision to take both children with her and leave the house during evening hours. This departure was highly irregular for several reasons. Velma rarely left home after dark, especially with both children, and the errands she claimed to be running were vague and unnecessary. Neighbors would later recall that she had seemed agitated and distracted in the days leading up to that night, as if wrestling with some momentous decision. When the family returned several hours later, they found their home engulfed in flames that had already consumed most of the structure. The Parkton Volunteer Fire Department responded quickly to the emergency call, but the blaze was too advanced for effective intervention. Firefighters focused their efforts on preventing the fire from spreading to neighboring properties, while the Burke family watched their life's possessions turn to ash. Thomas Burke's body was found in the bedroom where the fire appeared to have originated. The medical examiner determined that he had died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached him, a small mercy that spared him from the agony of burning alive. The scene investigation, conducted by Cumberland County Sheriff's deputies with limited training in fire forensics, concluded that Thomas had fallen asleep while smoking a cigarette. a tragically common cause of house fires in rural areas during that era. Velma's reaction to the tragedy appeared genuine and devastating. She wept inconsolably at the scene, had to be physically restrained from attempting to enter the burning house, and seemed completely broken by the loss of her husband and home. Neighbors and emergency responders noted her obvious grief and immediately rallied to support the widow and her 2 children. The funeral service at Parkton Baptist Church was attended by virtually the entire community. She accepted condolences with appropriate dignity, spoke movingly about Thomas's struggles with alcohol and chronic pain, and expressed gratitude for the community's support during her family's darkest hour. But there were subtle details that didn't quite align with the narrative of tragic accident. Several neighbors noticed that Velma had removed several valuable items from the house in the days before the fire. Family photographs, important documents, and small pieces of jewelry that she claimed to be cleaning or repairing. The timing of her departure with the children, leaving Thomas alone and intoxicated, struck some as unusually convenient. Most significantly, just 3 months after Thomas's death, the vacant lot where their home had stood experienced a second fire when debris that had been left to smolder somehow reignited. This second blaze, though smaller than the first, was significant enough to trigger an insurance investigation that ultimately resulted in a substantial payout to Velma. The insurance money, combined with a modest life insurance policy on Thomas and community donations organized by their church, provided Velma with more financial security than she had ever possessed. For a woman who had been struggling to make ends meet just months earlier, widowhood had proven remarkably profitable. What the community couldn't know was that they had just witnessed the birth of one of North Carolina's most methodical serial killers. Velma had discovered that murder, when properly executed and convincingly explained, could solve multiple problems simultaneously while generating sympathy and financial reward. The sweet-faced grandmother had tasted blood, and she would soon develop an insatiable appetite for more. The months following Thomas Burke's death revealed a side of Velma that few in the community had ever suspected existed. While maintaining her public image as a grieving widow devoted to her children's welfare, she began demonstrating a remarkable ability to attract and manipulate men who could provide the financial security and emotional stability she craved. Within 6 months of becoming a widow, Velma had begun a relationship with Jennings Barfield, a 43-year-old widower who owned considerable property in the area and maintained a comfortable income through farming and various business investments. Jennings was known throughout Cumberland County as a man of substance and integrity, someone who had successfully raised his own children after his first wife's death, and who was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in their social circle. Their courtship moved with a speed that raised eyebrows among their mutual acquaintances. While it was not uncommon for widowed individuals to remarry relatively quickly in that era, particularly when children were involved, the intensity of Velma's pursuit of Jennings seemed almost predatory to those who observed it closely. She attended social functions where she knew he would be present, found excuses to visit his property with small gifts or offers to help with household tasks, and generally made herself indispensable to his daily routine. Jennings, for his part, was genuinely attracted to Velma's apparent devotion and domestic skills. She was an excellent cook, a meticulous housekeeper, and someone who seemed to understand the importance of creating a stable home environment for children. Her religious faith, demonstrated through regular church attendance and involvement in various charitable activities, aligned with his own values and suggested a moral foundation that he found appealing. They married in August 1970, just 16 months after Thomas's death, in a ceremony that was more elaborate than Velma's first wedding, but still appropriately modest for a widow's remarriage. The service was held at Jennings Church, with both sets of children serving as witnesses to their union. The community generally approved of the match, viewing it as a practical arrangement that would provide security for Velma's children while giving Jennings the companionship and domestic partnership he had been missing. The early months of their marriage appeared successful on the surface. Velma threw herself into the role of Jennings's wife, with the same intensity she had brought to their courtship, managing his household with military precision and ensuring that his needs were anticipated and met before he even recognized them himself. She was particularly attentive to his business affairs, offering to help with bookkeeping and correspondence that he found tedious. But beneath this facade of domestic bliss, dangerous patterns were already emerging. Velma's prescription drug use, which had begun during the final years of her marriage to Thomas, continued to escalate despite her new circumstances. She was now taking a sophisticated cocktail of medications: Elavil for depression, Sinequan for anxiety, Tylenol the Thur for chronic pain she claimed to suffer, and Valium for sleep. Each drug was prescribed by different physicians in neighboring counties, making it difficult for any single doctor to recognize the extent of her dependency. The cost of maintaining this drug habit was substantial, far exceeding what her household allowance could reasonably cover. When Jennings questioned certain unexplained expenses, Velma initially explained them as necessary medical costs or emergency expenditures related to her children's needs. But as the amounts grew larger and more frequent, these explanations became increasingly implausible. The truth was that Velma had begun systematically stealing from Jennings's accounts, using her access to his financial records to forge checks and make unauthorized withdrawals. Her technique was sophisticated. She would write checks for amounts just below the threshold that would trigger automatic bank verification, space the transactions across multiple accounts to avoid detection, and carefully study Jennings's signature until she could reproduce it flawlessly. For several months this system worked perfectly. Jennings was a trusting man who rarely scrutinized his bank statements closely, and when he did notice discrepancies, Velma was always ready with reasonable explanations about household expenses or business costs that he might have forgotten. Her tears and apparent distress at being questioned were particularly effective at ending such conversations before they could develop into serious investigations. The situation began to unravel in early 1971 when Jennings's banker, a cautious man named Harold Mitchell, who had handled the Barfield family's finances for decades, noticed patterns in the account activity that seemed inconsistent with Jennings's normally conservative spending habits. Mitchell made discreet inquiries with Jennings about several large withdrawals and check transactions, conversations that gradually revealed the extent of Velma's deception. The confrontation between Jennings and Velma was explosive and definitive. Unlike Thomas, who had been weakened by injury and alcoholism, Jennings was a strong-willed man who would not tolerate theft or deception from anyone, including his wife. He demanded full disclosure of her financial activities, threatened to involve law enforcement if necessary, and ultimately informed Velma that he was consulting with an attorney about divorce proceedings. For Velma, this crisis represented an existential threat. Divorce would mean public exposure of her crimes, likely criminal prosecution for forgery and theft, and complete loss of the financial security that Jennings's death could provide through inheritance and life insurance. More importantly, she had learned from Thomas's death that permanent solutions were often more effective than temporary compromises. On the evening of March 22, 1971, Jennings Barfield began experiencing severe stomach pain that came on suddenly during what had seemed like a normal dinner. The cramping was intense and localized in his upper abdomen, accompanied by nausea that quickly progressed to violent vomiting. Within hours, he was also experiencing chest pain that he initially attributed to muscle strain from retching. Velma immediately assumed the role of concerned wife, calling their family physician and helping Jennings to the hospital when his condition continued to deteriorate. Dr. Patterson, who had treated Jennings for minor ailments over the years, was puzzled by the sudden onset and severity of his symptoms. Blood tests revealed elevated white cell counts, suggesting infection, but no specific pathogen could be identified. Despite medical intervention, Jennings's condition worsened throughout the night. The chest pain became excruciating. His blood pressure dropped dangerously low, and he began showing signs of cardiovascular distress. At 3:17 a.m., on March 23, 1971, Jennings Barfield died of what physicians diagnosed as acute heart failure, possibly triggered by a severe gastric infection. Velma's grief appeared genuine and overwhelming. She had to be sedated at the hospital and required assistance from family members to make funeral arrangements. The service was well attended, with Jennings's business associates and community members expressing sympathy for the widow. The timing of Jennings's death was particularly tragic because it occurred just as he had been planning to expand his farming operations and had taken out additional life insurance to protect his investments. These policies, combined with his existing coverage and property holdings, left Velma significantly wealthier than she had ever been. Within weeks of Jennings's funeral, Velma had settled his estate, collected insurance payments, and begun making plans for her future. She purchased a modest home near her parents in Fayetteville and enrolled her children in new schools, claiming that she needed to be closer to family support during her period of grief and adjustment. What she had actually accomplished was the perfection of her method. Unlike Thomas's death, which had required staging an accidental fire and dealing with property destruction, Jennings's murder had appeared completely natural. The symptoms she had induced with carefully administered doses of arsenic-based rat poison perfectly mimicked acute gastroenteritis, followed by heart failure. A progression that was medically plausible and required no external explanation. More importantly, she had learned to time her attacks with precision. The confrontation about her theft had occurred just days before Jennings's death, providing clear motivation for him to change his will or take legal action against her. By acting quickly and decisively, she had eliminated the threat while preserving her access to his wealth. Velma had evolved from an opportunistic killer who had eliminated an inconvenient husband into a calculating predator who understood exactly how to use murder as a solution to complex problems. The sweet grandmother had become a sophisticated serial killer, and she was just getting started. Moving back to Fayetteville placed Velma in close proximity to her aging parents, a situation that initially appeared to be motivated by genuine filial devotion, but would soon reveal itself as anything but coincidental. Her father, Murphy Bullard, was already in poor health, suffering from lung cancer that would eventually claim his life through natural progression. One of the few deaths in Velma's orbit that required no assistance from her. But her mother, Lillian Bullard, represented both an opportunity and a problem. At 74 years old, Lillian lived on a modest but adequate pension, supplemented by savings she had accumulated through decades of careful financial management. She was also becoming increasingly dependent on Velma for help with daily tasks, bill paying, and general household management, a dependency that provided perfect cover for the systematic theft that Velma had, by now refined into an art form. The pattern of their relationship quickly established itself. Velma would visit her mother daily, often bringing small gifts or prepared meals that demonstrated her devotion. During these visits, she would help Lillian organize her financial paperwork, balance her checkbook, and handle correspondence with banks and insurance companies. This assistance was genuinely appreciated by Lillian, who found the complexities of modern banking and bureaucracy increasingly difficult to navigate. What Lillian didn't realize was that her helpful daughter was using these opportunities to study her signature, memorize her account numbers, and identify the patterns of her financial transactions. Within months of returning to Fayetteville, Velma had begun forging checks on her mother's accounts and taking out small loans using Lillian's identity as collateral. The amounts were initially modest, $20 or $30 at a time, sums that could be explained as cash withdrawals for household expenses or medical needs. But as Velma's drug addiction continued to escalate and her tolerance for the various medications increased, she required larger and more frequent infusions of cash to maintain her habit. By the summer of 1974, Velma was stealing hundreds of dollars monthly from her mother's accounts. She had also discovered that Lillian possessed several valuable insurance policies and savings bonds that could be liquidated in case of emergency. The temptation to access these larger pools of money was constant, but doing so would certainly be detected and would raise questions that Velma couldn't answer convincingly. It was during this period that Lillian began experiencing the first mysterious health episodes that would become her daughter's signature. The symptoms would appear suddenly: severe cramping in her stomach and intestines, accompanied by nausea and diarrhea that would persist for several days before mysteriously disappearing. When these episodes occurred, Velma was always present to provide nursing care, bringing her mother special teas and broths that she claimed would help settle her stomach. Dr. William Stevenson, Lillian's physician for over 20 years, was puzzled by these recurring symptoms. Blood tests revealed nothing definitive, and the pattern of illness didn't match any standard diagnosis he was familiar with. The symptoms suggested some form of food poisoning or gastroenteritis, but Lillian wasn't eating anything unusual, and no other family members were affected when they shared meals with her. What Dr. Stevenson couldn't know was that Velma was conducting a careful experiment in dosage and timing. She had learned from Jennings's death that arsenic poisoning could mimic natural illness, but she needed to understand exactly how much poison would cause illness without death and how long the effects would last. Each episode with her mother was essentially a field test of different dosages and delivery methods. The psychological effect on Lillian was as important as the physical symptoms. Each bout of illness left her feeling weak and vulnerable, and grateful for her daughter's constant attention. The fear of another episode made Lillian reluctant to question any of Velma's suggestions about household management or financial decisions. During this same period, Velma began dating another man, Robert Mackenzie, a local businessman who had lost his wife to cancer the previous year. Robert was attracted to Velma's apparent devotion to her family and her reputation as a caring daughter and mother. Their relationship progressed steadily through the summer of 1974, with Robert beginning to hint at marriage and a future together. But in August 1974, Robert Mackenzie died in a single car accident on a rural highway outside Fayetteville. The circumstances were unusual. Robert was known as a careful driver who rarely traveled alone at night, yet he had apparently lost control of his vehicle on a clear, dry road and crashed into a tree at high speed. No mechanical failure could be identified, and toxicology tests were not routinely performed on accident victims in that era. Robert's death was convenient for Velma in several ways. Their relationship had been progressing toward a level of intimacy and commitment that would have made her other activities more difficult to conceal. More importantly, Robert had been asking questions about her family situation and finances that suggested he was becoming suspicious of certain inconsistencies in her stories. As Christmas approached in 1974, Velma knew that her mother's financial situation would soon be scrutinized by banks and insurance companies as part of their routine year-end audits. The amounts she had stolen were now substantial enough that discovery was inevitable unless she took decisive action to prevent any investigation. On the evening of December 28, 1974, during what should have been a peaceful holiday celebration with extended family, Lillian Bullard was struck by the most severe episode of stomach illness she had ever experienced. The pain was excruciating and constant, unlike the intermittent cramping of her previous episodes. The vomiting was violent and continuous, and she quickly became dehydrated and disoriented. Velma immediately took charge of the situation, calling for an ambulance and accompanying her mother to Cape Fear Valley Hospital. Throughout the crisis, she maintained the image of a devoted daughter, holding Lillian's hand during transport and staying by her bedside as medical personnel worked to stabilize her condition. Dr. Stevenson was called to the hospital to consult on Lillian's case, but he was as baffled as the emergency room physicians by the severity and progression of her symptoms. Blood work revealed significant abnormalities, but no specific cause could be identified. Intravenous fluids and anti-nausea medications provided temporary relief, but Lillian's overall condition continued to deteriorate. At 11:43 p.m. on December 30th, 1974, Lillian Bullard died of what hospital records listed as complications from acute gastroenteritis. The attending physician noted that the case was unusual in its severity and rapid progression, but in an era before widespread awareness of poisoning cases, the possibility of deliberate harm was never seriously considered. Velma's grief at her mother's death appeared profound and genuine. She wept openly at the hospital, required sedation to sleep, and seemed completely devastated by the loss of the woman who had been her closest family member. The funeral was a major community event, with Lillian remembered as a devoted mother and grandmother who had raised 9 children and lived a life of Christian service. The settlement of Lillian's estate provided Velma with additional financial resources, but more importantly, it eliminated any possibility that her theft would be discovered. With her mother dead, there was no one to question missing funds or forged signatures, and the estate proceedings actually legitimized Velma's access to accounts she had been looting for months. But perhaps most significantly, Lillian's death had provided Velma with absolute confidence in her method. She had successfully murdered her own mother, without arousing the slightest suspicion from medical professionals, family members, or law enforcement. The crime had been executed with clinical precision,